The morning mist clung to the tarmac like a burial shroud, and somewhere in the distance, a single rifle shot echoed across the Nevada desert. Staff Sergeant Marcus "Bulldog" Rodriguez lowered his binoculars, his weathered face creased with disbelief. The target, a rusted oil drum positioned at what everyone called legend distance, had been sitting untouched for 3 years. Until now. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the desert wind. "That's impossible." Behind him, the other Marines shuffled nervously, their boots scraping against the concrete. They'd all heard the stories about that target, how only 3 Marines in the history of Camp Pendleton had ever hit it, and 2 of them were already buried at Arlington. The third had become a general. Rodriguez squinted through the scope again, confirming what his eyes refused to believe. The drum bore a fresh hole, clean and precise, right through the center mass. He'd been running this range for 12 years, had seen hotshots from Quantico come and go, had watched snipers with confirmed kills in Fallujah miss that same target by yards. Yet somehow, impossibly, the new transfer had done it on her first day. Lieutenant Kestrel Ghost Thorne stood at the firing line, her M40A6 still smoking in the morning air. She was smaller than the others expected, barely 5'6" in her combat boots, with sandy blonde hair pulled back in a regulation bun that somehow made her look even younger than her 28 years. The Marines had been snickering when she walked onto the range. Another desk jockey playing soldier, they'd whispered. Fresh meat from some cushy Pentagon assignment. They weren't laughing now. Ghost's hands moved with mechanical precision as she cleared her weapon, her movements betraying years of muscle memory that spoke to something deeper than basic training. There was a stillness about her that made the desert itself seem restless by comparison. When she finally looked up from her rifle, her gray eyes held secrets that the Nevada sun couldn't burn away. "Beginner's luck," muttered Private Chin from somewhere behind the firing line, but his voice lacked conviction. Even the newest Marines could recognize the difference between luck and skill, and what they just witnessed fell squarely into the latter category. Rodriguez walked slowly toward the target, his boots crunching on the gravel. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of his assumptions was finally catching up with him. The hole in the drum was perfect, no jagged edges, no secondary impacts. A single, devastating shot that spoke to training far beyond anything the Corps typically produced. When he turned back toward the firing line, Ghost was already field stripping her weapon with the kind of casual efficiency that made seasoned Marines look like children playing with toys. She worked in silence, her fingers dancing across the familiar components as if she were playing a piano piece she'd memorized long ago. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly in all directions, but somehow, in that moment, the world felt much smaller. Ghost had learned to navigate suspicion the way other people learn to tie their shoes, with practiced indifference and an economy of movement that wasted nothing on unnecessary emotion. She'd been reassigned to Marine Corps Air Station Miramar 3 days ago, carrying orders that were maddeningly vague and a service record that had more redacted lines than readable text. The official story was simple: transfer from administrative duties, standard rotation, nothing to see here. The unofficial story was written in the careful way other Marines avoided meeting her eyes. "So, Ghost," Rodriguez said, approaching with the measured gait of a man who'd suddenly realized he might be outranked by someone he'd underestimated. "Interesting call sign for someone coming from a desk job." She didn't look up from her rifle maintenance. "Sir, with respect, I've never worked a desk job." Her voice carried the flat, neutral tone of someone who'd grown tired of explaining herself. "The transfer orders might say administrative, but that's not what I was doing." "And what exactly were you doing, Lieutenant?" For the first time since arriving at Miramar, Ghost smiled. It wasn't a particularly warm expression, more like the brief acknowledgement of a private joke that no one else was invited to understand. "That's classified, Sergeant, but I can tell you that there aren't many desks at 30,000 feet." The admission hung in the desert air like a challenge. Rodriguez felt something shift in his understanding, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place with uncomfortable clarity. The way she'd approached the rifle range with absolute confidence, the mechanical precision of her shooting stance, the call sign that suddenly seemed less like military humor and more like earned reputation. "You're a pilot," he said, and it wasn't really a question. "Was a pilot," Ghost corrected, her hands never pausing in their methodical cleaning of the rifle components. "Past tense. Now I'm whatever the Corps needs me to be." But there was something in the way she said it that suggested the past tense was more complicated than she was letting on. Rodriguez had seen enough combat veterans to recognize the particular weight that settled in someone's shoulders when they carried ghosts from missions that officially never happened. Ghost wore that weight like a second skin, so naturally that it had become part of her posture. The other Marines were starting to drift away from the firing line, their curiosity satisfied and their ego slightly bruised. They'd come expecting entertainment, another officer fresh from the Pentagon learning the hard way that real Marines didn't coddle their superiors. Instead, they'd witnessed something that made their own marksmanship achievements feel like participation trophies. Ghost finished reassembling her rifle with movements that were both efficient and oddly reverent, as if the weapon were something sacred that deserved proper respect. When she finally shouldered the strap and looked directly at Rodriguez, her gray eyes held the kind of steady focus that made him suddenly understand why her call sign wasn't ironic. "Sergeant," she said quietly, "I'm going to need access to the aircraft maintenance logs, all of them going back 6 months." She was already walking toward the barracks before he could ask why. The maintenance hangar at Miramar hummed with the kind of controlled chaos that marked any respectable military aviation facility. Mechanics crawled over FA-18 Super Hornets like ants attending their queen, their coveralls stained with hydraulic fluid, and their conversation punctuated by the pneumatic hiss of air tools. Ghost moved through the maze of aircraft and equipment with the confident stride of someone who belonged, even though she'd never set foot in this particular hangar before. Chief Petty Officer Diana Wrench Vasquez looked up from the engine intake she'd been inspecting, her dark eyes immediately sizing up the newcomer. 23 years in naval aviation had given Wrench an almost supernatural ability to spot trouble, and something about the quiet lieutenant with the regulation haircut and the 1,000-yard stare was setting off every alarm bell in her considerable experience. "You must be the transfer," Wrench said, wiping her hands on a shop rag that had seen better decades. "Heard you put on quite a show at the rifle range this morning." "News travels fast," Ghost replied, her tone carefully neutral. "I'm looking for Chief Petty Officer Vasquez." "You found her. What can I do for you, Lieutenant?" "I need to review maintenance logs for any FA-18s that have been experiencing unexplained mechanical failures in the last 6 months. Specifically, anything related to flight control systems or avionics packages." Wrench's expression shifted from mild curiosity to something approaching suspicion. "That's pretty specific for someone who's supposed to be administrative. You got clearance for that kind of review." Ghost produced a folded set of orders from her jacket pocket, the paper bearing signatures that made Wrench's eyebrows climb toward her hairline. She'd seen classified directives before, but these carried the kind of authorization that suggested someone very high up. The chain of command was taking a personal interest in whatever Ghost was investigating. "Well, I'll be damned," Wrench muttered, handing the orders back. "Looks like you're not just another Pentagon princess after all." "No, ma'am, I'm not." Something in Ghost's tone made Wrench take a second, longer look at the younger woman. There was a steadiness there that spoke to experience under pressure, the kind of calm that came from having made life-or-death decisions at velocities that didn't allow for second-guessing. It was the same quality Wrench had observed in her best pilots, the ones who could thread a Super Hornet through a thunderstorm and land it on a carrier deck in 15-foot swells without breaking a sweat. How much do you know about aviation maintenance, Lieutenant? Enough to know that when good aircraft start failing for no apparent reason, somebody's either cutting corners or covering something up. Wrench smiled for the first time since Ghost had walked into the hangar. I think I'm going to like you. Come on, let's go dig through some files. The maintenance office was a cramped space filled with filing cabinets, computer terminals, and the accumulated detritus of decades of military bureaucracy. Wrench pulled up the digital maintenance logs on her terminal while Ghost settled into the single spare chair. Her attention immediately focused on the screen with the intensity of a hunter tracking prey. The data told a story that became more troubling with each successive entry. Ghost leaned back in the uncomfortable metal chair, her fingers drumming silently against her thigh as she processed the information scrolling across Wrench's computer screen. 3 FA-18 Super Hornets had experienced what the official reports termed intermittent avionics malfunctions over the past 5 months. All 3 incidents had occurred during routine training flights. All 3 had been dismissed as equipment fatigue after cursory investigations. Tell me about the pilots, Ghost said quietly. Wrench pulled up the personnel files with a few keystrokes, her expression growing more concerned as she read. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez, first incident. 15 years flying experience, never had a safety violation. Captain James Mitchell, second incident. Marine Corps aviator, 2 deployments, spotless record. And Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Hayes, most recent incident. She's been flying longer than you've been alive, Ghost. What did they report during their debriefings? That's where it gets interesting. Wrench scrolled through the incident reports, her voice taking on the careful tone of someone who'd learned to read between official lines. All 3 described identical symptoms: primary flight display flickering, navigation systems showing false readings, and what Martinez described as the aircraft fighting her inputs. Ghost's expression didn't change, but something cold settled in the space behind her eyes. Any commonalities in their flight plans? All 3 were conducting high-altitude navigation exercises over the Chocolate Mountains. Different days, different times, but the same general airspace. Wrench paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Ghost, what exactly are we looking for here? Before Ghost could answer, the hangar's overhead speakers crackled to life with the distinctive tone that preceded priority announcements. All personnel, stand by for urgent message from base commander. All personnel, stand by for urgent message. The maintenance bay fell silent except for the ambient hum of electrical systems and the distant whistle of wind across the airfield. Ghost stood slowly, her entire body language shifting into a state of alert readiness that made Wrench suddenly understand why the lieutenant's service record was mostly classified. Colonel Patricia, Thunder. Morrison's voice filled the hangar with the kind of authority that made hardened Marines instinctively straighten their posture. As of 1400 hours today, Marine Corps Air Station Miramar is implementing heightened security protocols. All flight operations are suspended pending investigation of a possible security breach. Department of Defense investigators will be arriving within the hour to conduct interviews with all personnel. The announcement ended with the same electronic tone that had preceded it, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the desert air outside. Ghost and Wrench looked at each other across the maintenance office, both women recognizing the particular weight of timing that was probably not coincidental. Ghost, Wrench said carefully, I'm starting to think your transfer here wasn't quite as routine as your orders suggested. Ghost was already moving toward the door, her hand instinctively checking the position of her sidearm. Chief, I need you to make copies of everything we just reviewed. Store them somewhere that won't show up in an official search. That sounds suspiciously like you're expecting those DOD investigator to make certain files disappear. Ghost paused at the threshold, her gray eyes reflecting something that might have been regret. Chief, in my experience, When investigators arrive this quickly after someone starts asking the right questions, they're usually not interested in finding answers. The afternoon sun beat down on the Miramar tarmac with the relentless intensity that made the California desert a proving ground for both machines and the humans who operated them. Ghost stood in the shadow of an FA-18 Super Hornet, her regulation flight suit a perfect fit, despite the fact that she wasn't supposed to be anywhere near an aircraft cockpit, according to her official transfer orders. Chief Vasquez approached with a tablet in her hands and concern written across her weathered features. "The DoD team just finished their preliminary interviews," she said quietly. "3 of my best mechanics have been reassigned to other bases, effective immediately. No explanations, no appeals process." "Let me guess," Ghost replied without taking her eyes off the aircraft. "The 3 mechanics who worked on the planes that experienced those mysterious malfunctions." "How did you?" Wrench stopped herself, recognizing that she was probably asking questions that had answers she didn't want to hear. "Ghost, what the hell is really going on here?" Ghost finally turned away from the Super Hornet, her expression carrying the weight of decisions that had been made in classified briefing rooms by people whose names would never appear in official records. 6 months ago, I was flying combat air patrol over the South China Sea. My aircraft experienced the exact same symptoms described in those maintenance reports: flickering displays, false navigation readings, flight controls that didn't respond correctly to input. Equipment malfunction. That's what they wanted everyone to believe. Ghost's voice carried the flat certainty of someone who'd learned uncomfortable truths. But I managed to land safely and insisted on a complete technical investigation. What they found was a sophisticated electronic warfare system that could compromise aircraft avionics through targeted electromagnetic interference. Wrench felt something cold settle in her stomach. "You're talking about enemy action on American soil." "I'm talking about a weapons system that can turn our own aircraft into flying coffins without ever firing a shot." Ghost gestured toward the Super Hornet beside them. "The 3 pilots who reported malfunctions here were lucky. They were flying over empty desert when their systems went haywire. But what happens when this technology is deployed against aircraft approaching a carrier during combat operations, or during takeoff from a forward operating base?" The implications hit Wrench like a physical blow. An enemy that could disable American aircraft through electronic means wouldn't need to engage in traditional air-to-air combat. They could simply wait for American pilots to fall out of the sky, victims of their own sophisticated technology turned against them. "Why are you telling me this?" Wrench asked. "Because someone needs to know the truth before it gets buried under classified stamps and national security justifications." Ghost pulled a folded paper from her flight suit pocket, not official orders this time, but something that looked like it had been printed from a commercial email account. "I received this 2 hours ago. Effective immediately, I'm being transferred to a desk job at the Pentagon. No appeals, no discussion." Wrench looked at the transfer orders with growing anger. "They're silencing you." "They're trying to, but there's one problem with their plan." Ghost's smile held no warmth whatsoever. "I didn't come to Miramar to conduct an investigation. I came here to set a trap." The Super Hornet's engines wound up with a banshee scream that could be heard for miles across the desert, their twin exhaust plumes creating heat distortions that made the horizon shimmer like water. Ghost ran through her pre-flight checklist with the mechanical precision of someone who'd performed the same ritual hundreds of times. But there was an urgency to her movements that suggested this wouldn't be a routine training flight. "Ghost, you're not authorized for solo flight operations," came Colonel Morrison's voice through the radio, tight with barely controlled anger. "Return to the hangar immediately." Ghost's hands moved across the instrument panel with practiced efficiency, bringing the aircraft's systems online despite the increasingly frantic radio traffic from the control tower. "Tower, this is Ghost requesting immediate takeoff clearance for priority flight operations." "Negative, Ghost. You are ordered to shut down engines and report to base commander immediately. Tower, I'm declaring an in-flight emergency. Aircraft experiencing intermittent avionics failure and require immediate vectoring to alternate landing site. The lie came easily, partly because it might not remain a lie much longer. If Ghost was right about the electronic warfare system, and if her unauthorized flight had triggered the attention she was hopping for, then her avionics really would start malfunctioning once she reached the target airspace over the Chocolate Mountains. She advanced the throttles and felt 37,000 pounds of American engineering leap forward, with the kind of acceleration that pressed her back into the ejection seat. The Super Hornet ate runway like a hungry predator, its landing gear lifting off from California asphalt and carrying her into the crystalline blue sky that had been her natural habitat for most of her adult life. Ghost, you are in violation of direct orders. Colonel Morrison's voice crackled through the radio, but there was something else in her tone now, not just anger but concern. Whatever you think you're doing, it's not worth ending your career. Ghost leveled off at 15,000 feet and turned southeast toward the mountain ranges that marked the boundary between civilization and the kind of empty desert where secrets could be tested without witnesses. Colonel, my career ended 6 months ago when I reported what I saw over the South China Sea. This is about making sure other pilots don't die because someone decided the truth was inconvenient. Ghost, I don't know what you think you've discovered, but there are proper channels for. Ma'am, with all due respect, the proper channels are how 3 of my squadron mates ended up in body bags. Someone is field testing weapons systems against American aircraft, and they're doing it right here in our own backyard. The radio fell silent for a long moment, and Ghost used the quiet to check her navigation display. The Chocolate Mountains were 30 miles ahead, their jagged peaks rising from the desert floor like the broken teeth of some ancient predator. If her theory was correct, somewhere in those mountains was an installation that didn't appear on any official maps, a facility where enemy agents or compromised American personnel were testing electronic warfare systems against stolen or simulated U.S. avionics packages. Ghost, came a new voice through the radio, male, unfamiliar, with the careful diction of someone speaking from a secured facility. This is Agent Harris, Department of Defense Special Investigations. You are directed to return to base immediately for debriefing. Ghost smiled grimly and pushed the throttles forward, feeling the Super Hornet surge ahead with renewed speed. Agent Harris, I'm experiencing radio difficulties. Please repeat your transmission. She switched off her radio entirely and flew toward the mountains in silence. The Chocolate Mountains rose from the desert floor like a geological monument to violence, their twisted peaks and shattered ridgelines telling the story of tectonic forces that had been reshaping this landscape for millions of years. Ghost descended through 8,000 feet, her Super Hornet carving through the thin desert air with predatory grace, as she followed the navigation coordinates that had become burned into her memory during long nights of studying satellite imagery and geological surveys. Canyon X7 wasn't marked on any civilian maps, but military cartographers had designated it as a restricted airspace zone, with the kind of bureaucratic vagueness that usually meant someone was conducting activities they didn't want observed. Ghost had spent 3 days analyzing the canyon's dimensions and approach vectors, calculating sight lines and radar shadows, with the meticulous attention to detail that separated living pilots from memorialized ones. Her primary flight display flickered once, so briefly that she might have missed it if she hadn't been waiting for exactly that sign. Then it happened again, and Ghost felt the familiar cold weight of confirmation settling in her chest. She was being actively targeted by the same electronic warfare system that had nearly killed her over the South China Sea. The difference was that this time, she was ready for it. Ghost had spent 6 months preparing for this moment, studying the electromagnetic signature of the weapons system and developing countermeasures that weren't part of any official training manual. She flipped a series of switches that isolated her primary navigation systems and activated a backup instrument package that she'd personally installed during her 3 days at Miramar, equipment that operated on frequencies the enemy system wasn't designed to target. Her backup altimeter showed that she was now flying through a narrow canyon at 4,000 feet, with rock walls rising on both sides like the arms of a stone trap. Ahead, tucked into a natural alcove that would be invisible to satellite observation, Ghost could see what she'd come looking for: a collection of prefabricated buildings and antenna arrays that had no business existing in restricted military airspace. The facility was small, perhaps a dozen structures total, but the sophistication of the equipment was immediately apparent. Massive parabolic antennas pointed skyward like metal flowers following an electronic sun, while smaller directional arrays tracked her aircraft with mechanical precision that spoke to automated targeting systems. Ghost armed her aircraft's targeting pod and began recording everything she could see, the digital cameras capturing evidence that would either vindicate her investigation or serve as proof of her final mission. Either way, the truth would survive even if she didn't. That's when her flight controls started responding incorrectly to her inputs. The Super Hornet stick felt sluggish in her hands, as if the aircraft were fighting her commands with electronic stubbornness. Ghost compensated with the kind of instinctive adjustments that came from years of flying in conditions where mechanical failure meant death. But she could feel the electromagnetic interference growing stronger as she approached the facility. Below her, she could see personnel scrambling around the antenna arrays, their movements suggesting panic rather than routine operations. Someone down there had been caught conducting unauthorized activities, and Ghost's unexpected arrival was forcing them to make the kind of hurried decisions that usually led to mistakes. Her radio crackled back to life without her touching any controls, filled with voices speaking in what sounded like Mandarin Chinese. The realization hit Ghost like a physical blow. She wasn't just witnessing the testing of electronic warfare systems against American aircraft. She was looking at a foreign intelligence operation conducted on American soil, using stolen or compromised technology to develop weapons specifically designed to kill American pilots. And she was flying directly into their kill zone. Ghost's training kicked in with the kind of automatic response that bypassed conscious thought, her hands moving across the instrument panel, with movements drilled into muscle memory through countless hours of emergency procedures practice. The Super Hornet's engine screamed as she pulled into a vertical climb, using raw power to escape the electromagnetic field that was trying to turn her aircraft into 37,000 pounds of falling debris. The Chinese voices on her radio were becoming more urgent, their tones suggesting that someone was very unhappy about an American military aircraft discovering their secret facility. Ghost could hear what sounded like launch commands being issued, and her threat warning system began painting contacts that were definitely not part of any authorized American operation. 2 surface-to-air missiles streaked up from the canyon floor, their smoke trails describing perfect mathematical curves as they sought to intersect with Ghost's climb trajectory. She had perhaps 10 seconds before the missiles reached intercept range, and her aircraft's defensive systems were still being jammed by the electronic warfare equipment below. Ghost rolled inverted and pulled negative Gs, diving back toward the canyon floor in a maneuver that pushed both pilot and aircraft to the edge of structural limits. The missiles overshot her position and detonated harmlessly against empty sky, but she knew there would be more. The facility below had revealed itself as a hostile installation, and Ghost was now an active threat that needed to be eliminated. Her backup communication system crackled to life with an encrypted frequency that she recognized from her classified operations over the South China Sea. "Ghost, this is Overwatch. We have been monitoring your transmission and are vectoring support to your position." Relief flooded through Ghost's system like a drug. Overwatch was the call sign for a classified intelligence operation that she'd participated in 6 months earlier, the same mission that had led to her discovery of the electronic warfare system. If they were monitoring her current situation, then someone at the highest levels of military intelligence had been expecting this moment. Overwatch Ghost. I have positive identification of hostile installation in Canyon X7. Request immediate air support and electronic countermeasures. Ghost, support is en route. Maintain current position and continue documentation. This is priority Alpha intelligence collection. Ghost armed her targeting pod and began systematic recording of the facility below, capturing detailed imagery of the antenna arrays, building layouts, and personnel movements. Even if she didn't survive the next few minutes, the intelligence she was gathering would provide definitive proof of foreign intelligence operations on American soil. Another pair of missiles launched from the canyon, their targeting more precise this time. Ghost jinked hard left and activated her chaff and flare dispensers, filling the sky with metallic confetti and thermal decoys designed to confuse incoming weapons. The first missile lost lock and exploded against the canyon wall, but the second adjusted its trajectory and continued tracking her aircraft. Ghost pulled into another vertical climb, her G-suit inflating to keep blood flowing to her brain as the Super Hornet's engines pushed her skyward at acceleration that would have crushed an unprotected human body. The missile followed, its exhaust plume leaving a white scar across the desert sky as it climbed after her. At 12,000 feet, Ghost rolled inverted again and dove straight down toward the facility, using her aircraft's superior speed and maneuverability to force the missile into an impossible intercept geometry. The weapon lost tracking at the last second and impacted the canyon floor in a fireball that sent debris flying in all directions. But Ghost wasn't finished. She lined up her aircraft for a strafing run on the antenna arrays below. The Super Hornet's 20 cannon spoke with a voice like thunder, its depleted uranium rounds chewing through the sophisticated electronic warfare equipment with surgical precision. Ghost walked her fire across the antenna arrays, watching million-dollar technology disintegrate under the impact of projectiles moving at nearly 3 times the speed of sound. Each burst from the cannon sent streams of sparks cascading across the facility as delicate electronic components were reduced to scrap metal and silicon dust. The massive parabolic antennas collapsed like metallic flowers, their structural supports severed by rounds that had been designed to punch through armored vehicles. The Chinese personnel below were scattering in all directions, abandoning their equipment in favor of whatever cover they could find among the rocky outcroppings of the canyon. Ghost could see vehicles racing away from the facility, carrying personnel who had suddenly discovered that conducting covert operations against the U.S. military was significantly more dangerous than they'd anticipated. Ghost, this is Overwatch. Be advised, you have multiple fast movers approaching your position from the southeast, friendly aircraft inbound for support. Ghost looked over her shoulder and saw 4 F-22 Raptors approaching in perfect formation, their angular profiles cutting through the desert air like mechanical birds of prey. The cavalry had arrived, and it was flying the most advanced air superiority fighters in the American arsenal. Overwatch Ghost. Target facility is neutralized. Electronic warfare capability appears to be offline. Copy Ghost, RTB for debrief. Outstanding work. Ghost turned northwest toward Miramar, her aircraft trailing smoke from the cannon runs but otherwise intact. Behind her, the secret facility burned in the desert canyon, its cover blown and its mission compromised beyond any hope of recovery. But as she climbed toward cruising altitude, Ghost realized that her real mission was just beginning. The evidence she'd gathered would need to be analyzed. The intelligence networks that had enabled the facility would need to be rolled up, and the American personnel who had been compromised would need to be identified and dealt with. The Chinese operation in Canyon X7 had been stopped, but Ghost suspected it was only one tentacle of a much larger organism. The debriefing room at Miramar was sterile in the way that only military facilities could achieve. All polished metal surfaces and fluorescent lighting that seemed designed to eliminate any possibility of comfort or concealment. Ghost sat at a metal table that reflected the harsh overhead lights, her flight suit still showing the sweat stains and G-force stress marks of combat flight, facing a panel of officers whose ranks and agency affiliations suggested this conversation would determine the trajectory of several careers. Colonel Morrison sat at the center of the panel, her expression carefully neutral but her eyes holding the kind of intensity that suggested personal stakes in the outcome of this debriefing. To her left sat Agent Harris from DoD Special Investigations, the same voice that had tried to order Ghost back to base during her unauthorized flight. To her right was a man who'd introduced himself only as Mr. Smith, and whose presence radiated the particular authority that came with intelligence community credentials. "Lieutenant Thorne," Colonel Morrison began, her voice carrying the formal tone of official proceedings, "your actions today constituted a clear violation of direct orders, unauthorized use of military aircraft, and engagement with unknown hostile forces without proper authorization." Ghost nodded once, accepting the charges without argument. "Yes, ma'am, I understand the seriousness of my actions." "However," Morrison continued, and her tone shifted slightly towards something that might have been approval, "the intelligence you gathered appears to have exposed a significant national security threat that had been operating undetected on American soil." Agent Harris leaned forward, his fingers steepled in the way that people did when they were trying to project authority they weren't entirely sure they possessed. "Lieutenant, the facility you attacked has been under surveillance by federal agencies for the past 3 months. Your interference may have compromised an ongoing counterintelligence operation." Ghost's expression didn't change, but something cold and dangerous flickered behind her gray eyes. "Sir, with respect, if federal agencies have been aware of Chinese electronic warfare testing against American aircraft for 3 months and haven't taken action to protect American pilots, then perhaps the compromise was acceptable." "That's not your decision to make, Lieutenant." "No, sir, it's not. But when I see American pilots dying because someone decided that gathering intelligence was more important than stopping an active threat, I tend to stop worrying about whose decision it is." Mr. Smith spoke for the first time since the debriefing had begun, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that suggested he was accustomed to being listened to. "Lieutenant Thorne, your service record shows extensive classified operations over the past 5 years, operations that would have given you significant exposure to foreign electronic warfare capabilities." "Yes, sir." "And 6 months ago, you filed a report claiming that your aircraft had been targeted by sophisticated jamming systems during a routine patrol mission." "That's correct, sir." "A report that was classified and buried because it contained information that could compromise ongoing intelligence operations." Ghost leaned back in her metal chair, finally understanding the shape of the trap that had been built around her. "Sir, are you telling me that the incident over the South China Sea was a deliberate test, that I was used as an unwitting test pilot for enemy weapon systems?" The silence that followed her question lasted long enough to constitute an answer. Ghost felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of the past 6 months, pieces of a puzzle rearranging themselves into a picture that was significantly uglier than she'd imagined. "Lieutenant," Mr. Smith said carefully, "there are aspects of national security that require difficult decisions. Sometimes individual safety must be balanced against larger strategic considerations." "How many pilots?" Ghost asked quietly. "I'm sorry." "How many American pilots have been used as test subjects for Chinese electronic warfare systems? How many have died so that you could gather intelligence on enemy capabilities? The question hung in the air like an accusation that no one in the room seemed prepared to address directly. Ghost could see the answer in their careful expressions, in the way they avoided meeting her eyes, in the particular weight of silence that suggested numbers too high for comfortable acknowledgement. "Lieutenant Thorne," Colonel Morrison said finally, "you're being offered a choice." The word choice carried implications that Ghost recognized from her years of classified operations. In the intelligence community, choice usually meant the difference between cooperation and consequences, between playing along with official narratives and facing the kind of career destruction that left no appeals process. "I'm listening, Colonel." You can accept promotion to major and transfer to a position with the Defense Intelligence Agency, where your experience with electronic warfare systems would be valuable in developing countermeasures. Your actions today would be classified. Your service record would reflect commendable performance under difficult circumstances, and you would continue serving your country in a capacity that utilizes your unique skills. Ghost nodded slowly, understanding that this was the carrot portion of the choice being offered, and the alternative: court-martial for violation of direct orders, unauthorized use of military aircraft, and compromise of classified operations, dishonorable discharge, loss of all military benefits, and prosecution under the Espionage Act for revealing classified information. The stick was significantly larger than the carrot, but Ghost had been expecting something like this from the moment she decided to take unauthorized action. The intelligence community didn't tolerate loose cannons, even when those loose cannons uncovered genuine threats to national security. "How long do I have to decide?" she asked. 24 hours, Mr. Smith replied. "The offer expires at 800 tomorrow morning." Ghost stood up from the metal table, her movements carrying the controlled precision of someone who'd made difficult decisions under pressure before. "Sir, I'll need access to a secure communication system. There are people who need to know what happened here today, regardless of what choice I make." "That won't be possible, Lieutenant. This debriefing is classified, and you're restricted to base pending your decision." "I understand, sir." But as Ghost walked toward the door of the debriefing room, her hand instinctively checked the position of the encrypted communication device that Chief Vasquez had slipped into her flight suit pocket before her unauthorized mission. Some truths were too important to be buried under classification stamps and national security justifications. The truth about Canyon X7 was going to survive, regardless of what happened to the pilot who'd uncovered it. The barracks at Miramar were quiet in the way that military facilities became during the small hours of morning, when most personnel were either asleep or standing watch at posts scattered across the base perimeter. Ghost sat on the edge of her narrow bunk, her laptop computer glowing in the darkness as she typed carefully worded messages to encrypted email addresses that belonged to journalists, congressional staffers, and retired military officers who'd built reputations on exposing government malfeasance. The communication device that Chief Vasquez had provided was a civilian smartphone modified with encryption software that military counterintelligence teams would have difficulty tracking. Ghost had spent 2 hours composing messages that contained enough verifiable details to be credible, without including information that could endanger ongoing operations or compromise other personnel. The story she was telling was simple and devastating. Foreign intelligence services had been conducting weapons tests against American aircraft on American soil, with the knowledge and tacit approval of elements within the U.S. intelligence community. American pilots had been used as unwitting test subjects, and at least